could use that as a beginning note. Thank you guys for tuning into Casual Conversations, the podcast with Dylan and Tony. Today is March 7th is when we're recording this. And today we're recording the episode part 2 of 45 to Life, The People's Response. Just to rehash, part 1 was a lot more about what the president has done recently and about the past month and a half or so, and how that's made us feel. And part 2 is much more about, or a little bit about the media's response, not much, but a lot more about us as the constituents' response to what's been going on lately and how me and Dylan personally feel about the subject. Yeah, and just to bring us up to speed, it's been a week since... It's weird because we're releasing both these episodes at the same time, but it's been about a week since we recorded the last episode, and as far as things going on, like we said in the last episode, things happens every day and it's hard for us to keep up. But the major thing that we wanted to bring up was about how within just this past week he gave his speech at the joint congressional hearing, and how from a week the approval ratings of that speech was really high, and it seemed like everything was on a good track, and just within 1 week he's kind of tossed all away, and it feels like we're back to square one, really. And honestly, this is like the one point I wanted to bring up, even though it definitely just reiterates on how we talked or particularly Dylan talked very lightly about how the media feels very oversaturated with news of controversies or just things that he's done and said, and really reiterates on how difficult it is to keep up with this topic. But with all that being said, let's jump right into it. The first thing I wanted to talk about was Trump's relationship with white nationalism and rise in hate crimes. Honestly, I find it hard to talk about the rise in hate crimes without massive statistical support, because all that's come out is like, yes, we have seen hate crime that like we've never seen before, whether it's defacing of cemeteries or calling into bomb threats on Jewish communities. I mean, those are things we have seen before, but the rise in bomb threats and the like influx of it. But I find it hard to talk about it without like hardline statistical support, but those takes a long time to find like new trends, and I realize it's like bad to jump to conclusions, but where do you think we should draw the line between waiting for statistics and like when can we look at isolated incidents and being like, we need to put an end to this?
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I mean, I definitely am with you. Like, I value statistics a lot more with that kind of thing. But I think there is something to be said about the amount of attention it gets. Like, it may not be a rise in those actual events, but the amount of attention that they've been getting is far more than we've seen in a long time. You can see a lot of these things on major media sources talking about what's going on, and so even though maybe it hasn't risen, or maybe it has, I'm not sure, there's something to be said about it finally coming out into the open, I guess.
Yeah, that's definitely good that it's bringing a public eye to it. It's very important to be aware of these things. And yeah, like what we talk about often is a lot of times the incidents themselves don't mean much, but it means a lot more to at least us, as in like what does this incident say about society,
Yeah.
and where does it put like how people feel about stuff. I guess this is one of those things that's very important to note is even without hardline statistical threads over the years or anything like that, that it is still an important incident for us to bring attention to.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a little weird because I wrote my show notes like a week in advance, which for most topics that we want to talk about on the show seems like it'd be a good idea. But for this particular one, it seems like it already seems a little outdated, even though I wrote it a week ago. Originally, I had about. Originally, I had like wanted to talk about how Trump's Trump's reports on hate crimes, but specifically targeting Muslim groups, but lack thereof on any terrorist acts performed by white people, specifically the shooting in Canada, the Kansas shooting, and the cemeteries. And, he recently just mentioned it on his congressional hearing, so, like, it makes that part kind of not irrelevant, but less impactful, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it is still very relevant in that, like, why did he have to wait so long to talk about it? Like, in Trevor Noah with the news reporter, I hate how bad I am with names, and I don't remember anybody's name. But in the part with Trevor Noah with the CNN reporter, who talked about, he asked about affiliation and telling Trump to condemn the KKK a year ago, and he had a hard time with it. By that, I mean he didn't do it. And with all these incidents happening, like, he's not just stepping right out and being like, hey, guys, defacing Jewish cemeteries is not okay. And instead he waits for a congressional hearing. Like, why is he saving that up? I think to that point, like, there's still a conversation that needs to be had about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even going back to his press hearing several years ago, several Trump years ago.
Trump years, such a hard measurement of time.
Yeah. Which is, let's see, one Trump year's like a week or something, so it was a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
He had that Jewish reporter who asked him about anti-Semitism, and his only response was, I am the least anti-Semitic person that you have seen, or something along those lines, and then said, I'm the least racist person. That's like his only response. He doesn't outright say, like, I don't support those. Just brings it back to this conversation about himself. He's
egocentric.
Yeah.
And a celebrity president, as specifically Trevor Noah really likes to call him.
Yeah. And I guess kind of bringing up even conversations we talked about from the prior podcast, this whole incident with his congressional hearing and everything else really that Trump does, talking about the recent thing about Obama spying on him and stuff, it's just starting to become more and more apparent that Trump is just like this clown that we can divert our attention to. We can just look at him and look at all the shenanigans he's up to, and it kind of distracts us. And he's even like rewriting history in a way by like trying to make these claims now that they're doing all these things for the people, like in his congressional hearing, all the things that he mentioned about helping people, and how they're doing the total opposite of that. So, I don't know.
Yeah. And, I mean, it really relates back to the conversation. That was one of the topics that I think honestly floated between these two episodes the most for me, is his relationship with truth and the idea that we live in a post-truth world. Is those two things are just so tied in together. I honestly had a really hard time deciding which episode it belonged more on. And more about the idea that he's been wiretapped. Well, journalists are kind of sprawling. I mean, he's already on to the next thing again, but journalists are kind of sprawling to figure out, like, where did he get this from? And the most likely that they found is probably Breitbart again, which is, like, known to be it's known to be a website that reports on just, what's the word I'm looking for?
Conspiracy theorists?
Yes.
Theories?
It's a website known to report on conspiracies. And they try to track, okay, where did Breitbart get this from? And it tracks to another article. And then that article, where did they get it from? They don't cite anyone. And they look for the reporter. And basically they found 5 articles that have relevance. And 2 of them report on something, I think it's called, like, the FASA. It's like the Federal Association of Secretive whatever. It's some, like, weird CIA initiative, like weird intelligence initiative that no one's heard of. But 2 of them cite this initiative and how Obama asks. They cite slightly different things, but the general gist of it is they talk about how Obama asked to wiretap Trump, and the intelligence community said, no, we won't do that. And then Obama broadened it, or changed the wording a bit, and said, hey, we want to wiretap Trump's towers and servers because we think there are Russian banks, like, illegal dealings there. And, like, that's why it was tapped. But out of the 5, only 2 of them are not just referring to another article as they do nowadays. Like, people read an article on one site and just start reporting on it instead of doing journalism on their own. Much like we're doing, but we're not journalists, so it's okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, they traced it back to 2 of them, and of the 2 of them, they don't really point out any real sources, and then they are actually just, in a very coincidental turn of events, both of them are from British sources.
Cool.
Yeah, like, the writer of one article is, like, a freelance writer that's British, and then the other one's from a British news source. As of right now, there are no independent sources that are actually from an American media outlet, and the intelligence officer, I think it's the director of intelligence, I don't remember his exact title either, but the guy that was in power of the intelligence agency back when Obama's administration was in power, he almost instantly came out and did a press hearing and said, like, hey, I'm the guy who is the top dog of the intelligence agency back when Obama was in power. If such a thing actually happened, I would definitely know about it. And I'm here to tell you that no such thing happened. So, I mean, people can lie, but honestly, like, it seems like it's more things just founded on falsehood.
Yeah. Well, and it kind of, I think this particular example goes back to what I said in the previous episode, just about how Trump and his administration creates some kind of scandal, or some kind of scandal comes out about them, and the media scrambles to fact check it, to talk about it, and the dude's already on to, like, 12 other things by this point. I forget what all they've put forward, but they've put so much stuff out just in the past few days about like trying to dismantle different departments. And
today, just this morning, I read, this wasn't an article or anything, it was just one of my friends on Facebook posted, but apparently the first dismantling of the education department has started.
Yeah.
They just put out a bill proposal that defunds like a specific act to protect a lot of early education services, which is terrible.
Yeah. So I guess that's even more reason to talk about the people's response.
I mean, talking about being derailed, like, I just went on for, 10 minutes about this topic, and we're sitting here trying to talk about white nationalists instead. Like, it's so hard not to get derailed.
Well, I think it's so much easier to talk about the scandals because they're so obviously messed up and like so obviously stupid and whatever, but to talk about the really like horrible and threatening things going on right now it's really difficult. It's really depressing, and for a lot of folks, like you and I were talking about earlier, about just kind of my privilege as a white person, not seeing the underlying racism that's been going on my entire life until now, really, where it's starting to come out. And so, yeah, it's really hard to talk about these things because it's depressing and it's harder to have a solution to than, like, Trump lying. There's obviously easier solutions to that, but with talking about white nationalism, talking about oppression of any marginalized group, there is no easy solution.
Yeah, it's like how Trevor Noah in his show joked about there being two Trumps now, and I kind of hope that there isn't going to be, because like people ate that speech up. Like, two polls I saw online of different news sources reported that his presidential address to Congress got 76 to 78% of the population to feel the speech was positive, which hopefully it's in the same way that Trevor Noah feels that the speech is positive, and they understand that the speech and the man speaking it are two different people or two different things. But I highly doubt that, and I'm kind of really afraid of this idea that Trevor Noah puts out, that there's a blue tie and a red tie Trump. That there's, like, from now on, there's going to be a blue tie Trump, which is the one that knows how to talk and just basically reads teleprompters. Like, people can do that. But just knows how to stay on the note cards and just read whatever people tell him to say, and kind of just deceives the public into thinking that he's not as bad as he was before. Like, he's our president now. This blue tie Trump is actually a really scary concept to me. And your point of bringing up on why scandals are easier to talk about honestly makes me think that I'm starting to be under a three-tie theory. Which is honestly, like, the blue tie Trump is gonna be the, like, public outlet, speeches, making people feel good Trump, making people feel like we're not screwed Trump. And then the red tie Trump is the Twitter Trump, is the Trump that spouts out nonsense that he reads from Breitbart, sees a conspiracy theories online or on cable news and starts spouting out nonsense and starting scandals left and right. Like, that's the red tie Trump, which is honestly to distract us from, like, a scarier, more menacing, like, white tie Trump. Yeah. For lack of... red, white, and blue. There's America. But yeah, for lack of a better idea, like this secret Trump, which is more intelligent than we see or he displays himself to be, where like this is just a tactic to divert us from things like the education thing going on or the bills he signed for like against clean water and clean air. Like all of that stuff's going on in the background. And because he knew he was going to sign a bunch of stuff and he didn't want the media to have the chance to report on it, he's like, what crazy thing could I say right now to distract him for a second? That's right, Obama wiretapped me.
Yeah.
Like, that's a way scarier concept to me.
Well, I mean, in a way, that's been going on in a way where it's not necessarily like a white tie Trump, but like his administration.
Yeah.
And I think that I'm not really sure if Trump is just stupid and really like has no idea what's going on, or if he is this like really, I guess, evil person planning all these things. But either way, I guarantee his administration loves that he's this huge distraction and that we can spend however long we've spent even in this podcast talking about some of the silly scandals, you know?
Yeah.
And just like the obvious stupidity of this guy. But meanwhile, his administration is doing the same BS.
Just behind the ground hiding it. Like,
yeah.
I'm sure, yeah. And that's like my idea of like a white tie Trump definitely isn't just Trump.
Yeah.
It's much more of the people pulling the strings or the people in the background doing stuff too. Bannons, the Vosses. Last night while I was like finalizing the show notes, I had this like really creepy realization of why DeVos scares me. Is she seems like an evil villain to me. Like the show here, not the show. I think everything's a podcast now. No, but before she was voted in, which we'll talk about later, but before she was voted in with the Congress like grilling her on things and her being like, I believe in
accountability.
Yeah, it was accountability. Where she's like, I believe in accountability. And they're like, but that's not the question. She's like, I believe in accountability. Like, just like her tone of voice was like very, very maniacal and like sinister to me.
With a smile on her face and everything.
Yeah, like, I just realized that was a single incident that in the back of my mind, I like labeled her as a villain. And I'm just like, oh shit, I'm scared. And this was like 6 a.m. finalizing show notes, like, oh my gosh, Betsy DeVos is scary. She's terrifying. But yeah, like, so her and like everybody else really plays into this, like, my idea of the white tie Trump.
I like that idea of it.
Yeah.
Red, white, and blue.
Yeah.
It's all coming together. Well, and I mean, the whole idea of all of that, particularly the blue tie Trump, is something that I think all political parties have done very successfully in a lot of ways, and that the most brilliant way to make a system is make one in which people are appeased just enough to not ask any more questions. And that's what the blue tie Trump's purpose is people are like, oh, he's not as bad as we thought because he mentioned, Muslims and whatever. And
Black History Month.
Yeah, and Black History Month. But that's something all parties have always been guilty of because the same stuff happens. Maybe not as much with whoever, but still, like, there's always problems, and when you can get people to at least be like, well, things aren't that bad, that's when things can get pretty bad because then they stop asking questions.
Yeah, honestly, that's definitely one of those things that's not Trump exclusive. If anything, people think it's out of character for Trump, which it seems like it is. It may not. Who knows what's really going on in his head besides himself. But honestly, like, that's how I look at politicians regardless, is all the presidents before we had always a blue tie and a white tie. There's just usually not this crazy Twitter ranting red tie.
Yeah.
And I think that is the thing that's unique to Trump. I feel like we've like flip-flopped the podcast. Like, this one's supposed to be about the people and that one's supposed to be about Trump. But in that episode, like, there wasn't anything immediately happening and, like, really striking that he did, so we ended up talking about the people. And in this episode, there is something immediately striking and important, so, like, we started talking about him in this one. But, yeah. Back to the topic. It's just, yeah, regardless of when he talked about it or how late it is, white nationalism and the rise in hate crime is really scary, and I honestly don't know what is the solution to that, because as we touched on shortly in the last episode, those sentiments and like thoughts and feelings have been there for a long time, and just now they're surfacing and showing their face. And honestly, I don't... Yeah, we talked about it in the last episode about, like, should they just stay hidden? Should they not? Well, like, now there's hate crimes happening. As of right now, it's not gotten to the point of, like, anyone being severely injured yet. Unless you want to count riots or minor incidents here and there, but to my knowledge, from what I've seen, there's not been anyone significantly injured from it.
There's been like several little events, like you said, but I think that they're small enough to be dismissed as like a lone wolf or that kind of thing that the media kind of talks about and spins in a way. Like, I know at one of Milo Yiannopoulos, if that's how you say his name, at one of his events, somebody who was protesting against him being there got shot by a supporter of him, and there have been a couple like violent outbreaks at things like that. More of these nationalists kind of, and more of these white nationalists emerging. I want to eat some pizza. I'm sorry.
Okay. Just take it out of the damn bag and put it on top. We're so fidgety. But yeah, hopefully something... I don't know what the solution is to that. Like, maybe Trump speaking out and condemning it for once will squall it. Who knows? Like, I think that's a much bigger social issue that needs dealing with, and it's something that I've asked myself for a long time now. I mean, since this issue's been important to me since, I don't know, I think I was like 13 when I first started like feeling like people were racist against me. I don't remember a single incident or anything. Actually, no. I do remember incidents, and that was from like 3rd grade. So, how old are you in 3rd grade?
What, like 8?
8 or 9? Yeah. So it's been like since 8 or 9 that I've been like, racism's a problem, guys. Oh god, I was the weirdest kid. But yeah, like, I've been like that since I was like 8 or 9. Obviously, at that age, it was on a much smaller scale, and then as I grew older, I realized more and more problems, and when I was younger, it was just more favoritism of teachers, and like now I look at institutionalized racism, and it really molded me as a person, I guess. Um,
You like that meme of, was it the
oh,
Enlightenment
the Enlightenment meme.
The first one is just like noticing minor like microaggressions.
Yeah. And then like I'm like full blown institutionalized racism now. Like this is a societal issue, which it is. Like,
Yep.
and I think that's like something that really needs conversations around, because I don't know if any place is truly successful in pushing away racism. But even if we don't do away with racism, I think there is a better place to be than where we are now. And I don't think that place is to just hope that the white nationalists or the lowercase KKK go back in hiding again. Because those feelings have been there, have always been there. They've never left. The other week we talked about how desegregations of schools was not really an effective thing, and I just don't think racism has ever not been around in this country. Like, I think, especially having President Obama as our president and being the first African American president, really lulled us into a state of being like, hey, racism's dead. How can we be racist when we have a black president? It's like people telling you they have a black friend, and that's that I can't be racist. My boyfriend's black. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, you still can be. And I think that's the interaction. I think that's like the biggest part of what Trump did is he enabled it, gave it a voice, and by not denouncing it, he's allowing the voice to continue. But he's really like uncovered this problem that's always been there to me. I just have never known what the solution is to that. Hopefully, the problem being uncovered as it is now will somehow lead to solutions, because more people see it and more people care about it now.
Yeah.
I guess it's my best hope for that.
Yeah, I mean, it was... God, I don't know if I can remember the article, but shortly after Trump was elected president back in November, I saw an article written by a person of color that talked about exactly that, saying, like, Trump is a good thing in a way, because Trump is going to wake a lot of white people up.
Hashtag woke.
Yeah, and finally get woke about some of these things that have been going on for people for a long time. I mean, Black Lives Matter in general was like that as well, because one day I actually was talking to a family friend of ours who is black, and he like mentioned the instances of violence towards black people is nothing new, and like that should come as like this really obvious thing when we say that. Like, even saying it just now is like, that should just be like, well, duh. But in a lot of people's minds, that wasn't a thing prior to, gosh, was Mike Brown the one that really sparked everything?
Or even, depends on how recently you're talking about. Like, earlier on, it's in California with, I don't remember his name. Oh, this is terrible. Oh, I hate not remembering names. No, I can't remember. I remember the one that was really publicized in California because he was beaten by like 8 officers at the same time on the side of a highway for a routine stop. And that was like the first really big one, because that was like when things started getting recorded.
Yeah.
and that was the first one that like started showing really prominently in the media. The recent resurgence is the biggest name I can think of is Trayvon Martin.
Yeah, which I guess wasn't police, but it was still a wake-up call to a lot of people that, yes, racism's out there and very threatening. It's not just your racist uncle saying things on Facebook. It's people out there actually killing people, so...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk about the term woke. Oh my gosh. So one of the best things I read about Get Out was this whole symbolism that's like behind it, and I think it was just like a random Facebook comment, but he was just, the guy noted that every time someone of color started acting like what's stereotypical of their ethnicity, the white people would be like, "Oh, I think you're just feeling tired," and he was like, that was a phrase that's repeated several times in the movie. They're like, so what's the black people supposed to do? They're supposed to stay woke. And I was like, oh my gosh! Like, either you're a genius or Jordan Peele is a genius, or both of you guys are. Like, that's so smart! But yeah, like, that's my thing on just saying woke. But I think as of right now, that's all I really have to say about white nationalists and hate crime.
Well, I think one other thing I feel like would be good mentioning here that I kind of just touched on with the last thing I said is that, you know, people talk, with this past election, there was a lot of talk about political correctness and about how people are just offended at everything nowadays. But I think this emergence, for lack of a better term, because they've always been there, but this emergence and kind of more focus on this white nationalism that's been going on is showing us that it's not about people being offended. And this is something that one of my friends had made a video about that I thought was a really good way of putting this, is that it's not that people are being offended. Being offended is, as my friend mentioned, is kind of a privileged thing. That's like me as a white person hearing somebody say the N-word and being like, hey, I don't like when you say that, I'm offended. But to a lot of black people, saying the N-word isn't offensive, it's threatening. It's something that is straight up like a scary thing for those people to hear, especially a white person say. So this idea of just separating the idea of being offended and the idea of being threatened is really important when talking about these things. Go. So many animals making noise.
But yeah, I think those differing views, because the idea that, because that is honestly a split view of kind of the left, of people who, the idea that they're all pro and against PC culture, I think is very left argument, which I think leads very well into our second topic, which is the idea that parties seem more split than ever on both sides. With the right, you have the hardcore, like, alt-right, or like the Trump purists, which refuse to believe anything he says is short of the word straight out of the Bible, versus the Republicans, who very much don't support them, regardless of if you believe in paid protesters or not. I personally don't. But regardless of if you believe it or not, it's not possible to believe that 100% of the people against Trump that are Republicans are just paid protesters. Like, I think it'd be silly for even red tie Trump to say that. So no matter what the actual numbers are, there are definitely Republicans who don't support them, and that's very apparent in the recent town hall meetings and what they call the like spring break of the Congress, and all the protests going on and just the whole craziness about that. First of all, like, what do you make of all of that?
Of all the protests at the town halls and stuff.
Yeah, because, like, even with the most recent thing we just saw with, again, Trevor Noah, but honestly, like, I've seen it everywhere. It's just most recently we just watched The Daily Show right before recording, so that's freshest in my mind. But
we get news from other places.
I swear, guys, last episode, it wasn't like we just saw 2 episodes of John Oliver and was like, hey, we're gonna report on this. And this episode, we just saw like 2 episodes of The Daily Show. It was like, hey, let's talk about this. That's saved for something else. But, yeah, so about the split in the right or the Republicans of like Trump purists and just regular Republicans. Like, I wouldn't even say they're moderate Republicans. They're just not pro-Trump Republicans. Like, what do you... Because, I brought up the Trevor Noah thing because the video of them at the town hall was protesters and supporters, but both of them are people who classify themselves as Republicans.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of thing gives me a little bit more hope just because simply from the idea that people are willing to question even somebody that they voted for or somebody that they supported previously, because that's something that gets so irritating, is this like blind support of any candidate, whatever party they're on. That's annoying to me because that just means people aren't really thinking for themselves. So I'm happy to see at least that these people are thinking for themselves. And I kind of actually was wondering how long this would take. Like, I knew from the very beginning when Trump got elected, like, this dude was going to let down a number of the people who he's, claimed to be representing. The, like, forgotten people that he talked about all the time,
Yeah.
He's bound to let them down just because he's a politician at the end of the day. Like, he's not going to get all of the things he says he wants done. He's not going to get them done. And also, he's proven time and time again that his interests really aren't in those people at all. He doesn't care. So I'm like, I have wondered how long it will take for a lot of people who supported him or people on the right to start questioning, like, is this guy really keeping our interests in mind, or...
And honestly, he put himself in much of like a lose-lose situation because let's just use the wall as an example. Like, Trump peers are like, yeah, he's gonna build that wall. He better build that wall. If he doesn't build the wall, he disappoints. And then there are slightly more moderate Republicans who are like, no, he doesn't mean a literal wall. He means figuratively. We need sovereignty of our land. And so if he builds a wall, he's going to disappoint them. So, I mean, at the end of the day, as a politician, regardless of what your intentions are, you can't please everybody. That's impossible for anyone. But particularly with some of the hardline stance that Trump put himself on, it's, like you said, it's really inevitable, and it's just a matter of time. And now that it's starting to come out, I'm actually really, really interested in talking to someone who considers themselves, like, either a moderate or, like, slightly right-leaning moderate, or just even if they don't, like, label themselves as anything as that, or even if they label themselves as, like, staunchly Republican, that's fine. I just want to hear more of their voice and how they actually view Trump. Specifically people who, like, voted for Trump and supported Trump during his whole election, and now that he's elected and we see who he is, and I'm interested in seeing how their perspective is on the current events. If I don't know, like, because that's something, like I said, like, this whole podcast is about starting conversations, and that's something that's so out of my realm. And whenever I told anyone about like this podcast, I've like sold it to my friends or talked to them about it. Like one of the first things they always ask me is, "Are you guys planning on having guests?" And I'm like, "Eventually." Like, and I still believe that. Like, it's supposed to be a conversation. It's not just between us, you know. Like we want this to be a bigger thing, but particularly for the first two episodes, it's probably gonna be just us two because I want to develop us as like hosts and for you guys to get to know us a little bit better before we start putting in other personalities. But honestly, like, because that's asked me so much, like, oh, are you guys interested in having guests? Like, the first person I wanted that popped into mind instantly was someone of that background, of someone who voted for Trump and supported Trump, but isn't a Trump purist. Like, it's not that I'm uninterested in talking to him. I think that we can learn from people regardless of what their beliefs are, if we believe in them or not. But it's more of I'm not that interested in seeing their side. But I am very interested in seeing how people who used to support Trump and their views now, because honestly, they're a voice that's very hard to listen out for with all the really, really loud white nationalists, or even if they don't believe in that, like Trump, hardline Trump purists. And with all the like really, really loud media that's just trying to cover what's going on, I find that either A, I don't really have many friends who fall in line of that, or maybe I do and they're just staying quieter because of whatever reasons they may have. But I just find that's a voice that's the most interesting to me, but I hear it the least.
Yeah, I mean, this past election there was really a big problem that went on where the left really did not do anything to focus on problems that are relevant to a lot of like white, rural, working class people who may or may not be racist. Like they might just be average folks who are just working class and...
She never went to Wisconsin!
Yeah.
Like...
So, there were a lot of people who were really upset by their lack of choices, really, in this election. And I think that Trump was speaking to a lot of those people. But like I said, inevitably, those people, if they haven't already, will be disillusioned because he does not have their interests at heart at all.
Yeah. And that's definitely very apparent in the recent things with all the town halls. Like, that's videos left and right of protests, of people hardline grilling the town halls. Ooh, like some of them are kind of hilariously crazy. Like, just one random one that I saw also happens to be from The Daily Show. Was one of the politicians was in the town hall meeting and they called out like, "Oh, hey, there's a little boy in the background. What's your question?" And the parents taught the like 7-8-year-old boy like talking points. And like the 7-8-year-old like had like legitimate points to ask, and he was just like, well, I mean, we're just doing the best we can, and like he's like trying to pick it up, and he's just like, Trump's trying to defund PBS Kids. that's not cool. Like, I don't like that. And I was just like, that's hilarious. Like, that's... yeah, and just, we're seeing the split now, and where it goes from here, I think, is very important.
Yeah.
And honestly, like, it just clicked to me now. I'm like, maybe it's the start of that split that's made Trump realize that he needs to pull out the blue tie Trump. But it leads well into... This was from the pamphlet I talked about last podcast about how to talk about immigration. And it refers to a lot about how... It's something I really believe in. Like, if you've known me for a decent amount of time, you know I love bell-shaped curves and the idea of a bell-shaped curve. But they really draw in the idea that, like, policies and politics are a bell-shaped curves as well. There are hardline people for it, hardline people against it, and that's usually, if you round it, around like 15% on either end. Like 10 to 15% of people who are hardline will not change their mind no matter what proves, whether qualitative or quantitative, about it. And generally speaking, there's like 70 to 80% that's in the middle of the bell-shaped curve, which we could be considered to be moderate. And honestly, like, politics isn't about pushing to your hardline supporters, is finding out different strategies of pulling those moderates to be on your side and not the other side. Which leads me into the topic of the moderates. Like, even people in the middle are split. I mean, just by definition, in the middle, they're gonna be split.
They don't agree on everything.
Yeah, but even that, like, seems more split than ever. Whether it's people like... It's much less now. It's still some now, but it's less than when he initially got elected. But the people who are like, well, whatever, he's our president now, we have to support him, let's try our best. Or the people who's more to the middle, but like slightly left-leaning, and is kind of pointing to the left and pointing out all their flaws.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly the people... The thing I'm thinking about, mostly talk about, is the people who are condemning protesters and riots. And the middle split, middle part, is... I don't know, I guess is a thing that's not as important because that's, by definition, is there. But I just like the idea that, like, every side's, like, fighting for a piece of that moderacy. And just, I think if nothing else, Donald Trump showed that there are very different ways to strategically fight for that, like, middle population.
Yeah.
But on the left, I think the argument that I'm personally most interested in is about how hard do we have to fight against Donald Trump. With protesters and a few of them breaking into riots, it leads into our third topic a lot more, but I just want to point out some, like, really interesting things that came out of it. In particular, I started watching this new segment called The Resistance, which, like, I know you've heard me talk about. But yeah, it's from GQ magazine, which is a men's style and lifestyle magazine, and now has a video segment with Keith Olbermann called The Resistance. And it's... I think they're, like, almost 40 episodes in now.
Wow.
Yeah, like, he's put in several videos a week, and it's gotten to a point where he's just calling for Trump to be on a court, and, like, he's, like, calling for his impeachment. And that is just like a hard left line for me, which I don't particularly disagree with, but it's just that's from a men's style and lifestyle, like style, like attire and lifestyle magazine. That's amazing and crazy and
Yeah.
all the stuff that I don't even know how to describe. But yeah, there's definitely, I think, still a little bit of ideas of like, hey, we should just try to support him. Like, there's definitely a very. We talk a lot about how topics are can be viewed as pro and anti the opposite thing. Like, pro something or anti the opposite thing. And I think that split is more apparent in the Democrats now more than ever. There's definitely like an anti-Trump sentiment, and then like pro he's our president. So there's definitely one side that's directly trying to conflict with what he's doing, and then another side that's just like, hey guys, we should just support what we like.
Yeah, and like work with that side to get the best or whatever.
Yeah. And I know where I personally stand on that. Actually, no, not really. I definitely see the merits of both sides. But I think it's a very important and hard to hit combination of the two that needs to be worked out for us to be able to succeed in this presidency.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you have any particular thoughts about the splits in the left that I didn't touch on or anything?
I mean, it's a lot of what I've seen is just the usual splits. Like, I've talked to several people about just the how useless this conversation of who is responsible for Trump even being elected is. And, you know, there's so many people on the left who want to blame, like, people who voted third party, people who didn't vote, because they always assume the non-voters are just all leftists.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think...
Tell me about it.
I think they have done research on that and figured out that most would be. But still, like, it's beside the point, and I don't know. I just don't think it's that... I don't think that that's useful at all. And then also with a lot of the divides around what tactics are and aren't okay or permissible to use in against oppressive systems or oppressive people is always a topic of disagreement for people on the left. You know, whether or not rioting is okay or whatever means of protest people have, there's always infighting over stuff like that.
Yeah, and that actually leads us exactly to my third point of this podcast, which are just views of riots and violence and how either side sees them and how, like, we see them. In particular, I think the most interesting case is the riot at Berkeley over Milo. Just, it started off as a protest and things escalated. And, yeah, I think more important than the riot that occurred at Berkeley is how we responded to it afterwards. Whether people thought it was okay or not. Since that's happened, I've looked more into Milo and how everything he says is just kind of an act to push his idea of he's just hardcore First Amendment believer, and that no matter what ridiculousness comes out of his mouth or whatever, like, he openly admits several times that what he says is absolutely crazy, but he believes in our First Amendment rights, and he just wants to keep pushing that idea no matter what it may be. And obviously this is a week late, so things happened last week. Actually, this is 2 weeks late, just about. So within these 2 weeks, Milo's kind of hopefully faded into a area that we won't hear much from him again, since his whole scandal with the pedophilia talks and whatnot, and that's not a subject that I feel is relevant to this.
Yeah.
But she does bring up a good point of like freedom of speech. And do you think, I've always been a big believer of like, yeah, there's freedom of speech, but there's institutions which, if they don't particularly like your speech, they also have the freedom to that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's, when I was young, it was in school. Like, yeah, I always understood freedom of speech, but I always also understood that schools are okay with me not, like, schools, it's okay for schools to not be okay with me just cussing up a storm and just spouting nonsense in school. And same thing with workplaces. I think private life and work life should be separated, but as far as firing people, I think that's not cool. If that's what you do, okay. But if like someone wants to not hire you based off of something they see off of your Facebook, I think that's perfectly within a company's rights. But I think the whole thing with Milo, for me, brought up a very important question, which, I mean, I personally know my answer to, but I think it's a question for society, really, that's shown that's more apparent and relevant in, is under what I believe and what I brought up with companies, perfectly okay for Berkeley to say, no, Milo, you can't speak here, we won't give you a platform. But Berkeley didn't say that. Berkeley's was very much founded on an institution that pushed for free speech very early on, and so it makes sense that they would support Milo and give him a platform to speak on. So they did. But I think the question for society is it okay for us to silence someone's free speech? And I think one of the like very relevant ideas, because I think a lot of people, especially a lot of the anti-protesters or supporters or anti-rioters, that's like, there's like two important lines I think needs to be distinguished in this conversation. Is one line of, is it okay? If it is, when is it okay to silence someone? And the other line is, how far can we go to silence someone? And I think both of those two lines are very important for us to figure out like where our stance is individually as people, and for us to figure out as a society where our stance is. It brings into like one of the quotes that I thought was kind of hilarious that my friend posted on Facebook. It's a quote from my friend, not from anyone like figurehead or anything. But to sum up, he said, you know, people often play this game of like mental game of, oh, if you could go back in time and kill baby Hitler, would you? And, you know, most people say yes. Most people have a pretty decent time saying yes to that. And as far as, like, I've known, most people I've known has had a pretty decent time saying yes to that. And oddly enough, that has brought up a weirder question, which is, what if you could go back in time and remove his freedom of speech and just silence him? Would you do that? Because I think that's the question now, like, and that's a much more thought-provoking question. If you say yes, it just brings up the two lines again. The line of, well, when should you speak up? Like, during what part of Hitler's rise to power should you have spoken up and silenced him? And how far do you go to silence him? Do you just media block him somehow? Like, if you had all the power in the world, like, would you just media block him? would you mute him and take away his ability to write? Or, like, do you mean, like, silence as in, like, assassinating him? So, like, that comes up to a second line of how far can we go and when is violence okay? At least that's, like, my whole view on the whole Milo thing.
Yeah.
And I think, like, we're all trying to figure that out for ourselves, and that's why I say this is a line for society to question. But I think a lot of people miss the point in that, yes, it happened, and it already happened. I think the bigger question is we need to figure out how we, as in, like, each other feel about that, not us personally.
Yeah.
Because all the media coverage I saw when that was quote-unquote relevant was covering, like, riots are not okay or riots are okay. And, like, I just don't think there's enough of a conversation in that. And I think it's very important too.
Yeah.
And you recently just brought to my attention about the riots at Berkeley yet again recently.
Yeah.
And honestly, it didn't pop up in the stuff I've looked at, so do you mind, like, summarizing that? What's up with
Yeah.
that?
Well, there were just national, not protests, but rallies for Trump on probably one of my favorite dates, which is March 4th. I love it because it's a command. Which kind of sucks that they took my favorite date. But anyway, so yeah, they had the March for Trump, and yet again at Berkeley, there was a big rally in which a bunch of anti-Trump and anti-fascist counter-protesters came up. It was like a peaceful protest for a while, and they had a violent clash, and I think several people got arrested on both sides. And yeah, it was just a pretty wild clash of people. But I read an article about how there were people even on the right who had planned to be violent at that, like they brought weapons and stuff like that. So I think it does bring up this conversation even more, and starting to stare us in the face even more, like what are okay tactics to use in these sorts of dire situations.
It's definitely a weird concept, because this isn't something I plan to talk about on this podcast. But last night I saw statistics of the past few weeks of people who are buying guns.
Yeah.
Have you, like, seen that at all?
Yeah, I've seen that it's spiked in people on the left.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's interesting and weird, and yeah. But I think it brings into this idea of just, like, that mentality of bringing a gun to a rally, or, like, trying to quote-unquote protect yourself in ways. And being one of the most important ones, which I forgot to show you before the notes, maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't, but it was a segment talking about how the fighting in town halls have been so, like, problematic for the senators that a few of them have canceled their traditional town hall meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And the excuse they've used was, oh, it's for security reasons. Like, people have gotten shot or whatever, and they note one specific lady who got shot. Have you seen that at all? It wasn't recently.
Oh, yeah, no, I haven't
Yeah.
seen that.
In the past, like, this lady got shot at one of the town halls. And what Trevor Noah said, and I do agree, in the best clapback possible, she comes on to, like, the news station, and she's just like, well, I think it's very important for the constituents to actually talk to the senators. And she's like, well, I've been shot and I recovered. She was like, I don't remember the exact quote, but it went something along the lines of like, I was shot in my town hall meeting on Friday, and by Monday, my office was completely open to the public and for people to step in and talk to me about anything they wish to. And she's like, and I don't think all senators should fear what might happen in town hall meetings. Yeah, and Trevor Noah's response was just like, that's the best clapback ever.
Yeah.
And I definitely agree with that. But I do think a lot more light needs to be shed on violence versus anti-violence.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this is the conversation that we need to have to figure out where others stand and where we stand as a whole. And unfortunately, there isn't a very good outlet for figuring that out. I mean, media can try to do its best. That's why it shows people for and against all the time. That's a new noise.
Yeah.
But I'm not... Although not being a massive supporter of any huge media, I do think that the Washington Post recently made a change that I think is absolutely beautiful. And they changed their tagline to "Democracy Dies in Darkness." And that tagline is just beautiful to me. I mean, with the perfect alliteration. Oh, and it's just such an important message as we talking about our last talk about post-truth and stuff like that. And stuff like that being the name of the last podcast because I said and stuff like that so many times. But really, that's what happens is democracy dies in the darkness of being shadowed by a overbearing government or being silenced by whatever. That's how democracy dies, and we, as much as the media ban and everything's going on, it's like we need the news and media and journalists, whether or not some of it may be like too early and like none of us can do a perfect job at anything, but we need journalists who are interested in continuing to try their best, continuing to uncover what's really going on.
Yeah. Yeah, this whole attack on, quote, the media from the right, but even on, I have friends who are, like, on the left who attack, quote, the media. It's just, it's pretty silly to me. I had a friend who studied communications, so he obviously was going to go into media, but he would always talk about how even just the phrase the media and how people say it, it's just so cringy because people talk about it like, oh, the media is forcing us to do this, and it's like, the media is a really broad thing.
Oh, yeah.
And can be anything from, a couple of bloggers to that, like, film things that happen in their community to, like, CNN,
Yeah.
So,
Or this. It's a podcast.
Yeah, it's media.
We got 20 people to listen to us in the first episode,
Yeah.
so we're just super hipster form of media now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this whole question of when violence is okay, if ever, has a lot of... it's just kind of a difficult question because I think looking back on something like Black Lives Matter, I say looking back as if that issue has been solved.
Yeah, it's been resolved, and that was years ago, and we're just so much better.
But say for the big Ferguson protests, I remember these conversations being had because so many people, of course on the right, but I'm going to talk more about the people on the left and how they talked about the people who rioted after the peaceful protests at that event. And what I think is upsetting about that particular instance is that this talk of whether or not that was okay is really dismissive of the emotions people were feeling and like the anger people had, and saying that's wrong or we shouldn't do that is like diverting the attention from how people are angry over the issue. And if they're, I don't know, I think it comes from like a really privileged perspective to be like, just turn that anger into peaceful protest and peaceful protest alone. And some people are going to be pretty reactionary about it. So having these conversations of it being right or wrong feels really useless to me in a lot of things like that. And I think for this most recent riot outbreak at Berkeley, it's kind of another difficult conversation to have because it is this suppression of other people's free speech.
Most recent being the one with Milo.
The one that the
more
March for
recent
Trump.
Okay.
Yeah. But both of them to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
I think the one for Milo I am a little more sympathetic towards because I know Milo has advocated for violence towards specific individuals at campuses, and I just in general, kind of like you mentioned earlier, freedom of speech to me does not mean freedom to have a platform everywhere you go. But the protest against the March for Trump is, I haven't really gathered my thoughts completely on that one. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really have much to say about that. But I guess I should just mention that, especially with the other examples, people on the left often talk about how riots and these kinds of protests are alienating to people who otherwise would support you. But I think in some ways the condemning of them is alienating in itself to other people. I don't know. I see so many people on the left condemn riots and condemn people doing certain things or speaking in certain ways, and I just think that's pretty absurd when we're all working towards the same thing or a similar thing. Oh, and on that note, from the Hitler's Rise to Power video from last episode that we talked about,
Yeah.
there was one other really important part that I wanted to mention where they talked about how they didn't cite it as a big cause or anything of Hitler's rise to power, but did mention it in passing about how the left was really fragmented and couldn't agree on what to do about the problem. And I think that there's a lot of parallels as the rest of as we mentioned, the rest of Hitler's rise to power almost uncannily is to Trump. I think that is another really interesting point.
And that's another parallel that would be very easy to overlook accidentally.
Yeah.
And it's definitely a very powerful player into that. Yeah, so with all that said, I guess the most important thing as the title of 45 to Life, the people's response, is, especially to us in particular, like me and you, is like, where do we go from here? I know we kind of painted a pretty scary picture with our last episode ending on comparing Trump to Hitler, and this topic doing that again and talking about riots and necessary violence. But I guess the real question is, like, where do you think we go from here?
I think we should start talking about common goals and not necessarily alienating different groups of people because of their tactics or their beliefs, but see the goal as being destroying nationalism or, you know, taking down this regime that is extremely problematic. Because I see people so caught up in this, like, well, again, to bring it back to the Berkeley riots at the March for Trump, this article I read on the Washington Post about it mentioned several times how this group of rioters was specifically these anarchists, and they're really vilifying anarchists in this article and talking about how their goals are not the same and they're not part of the group, which in a sense is true. Like, an anarchist's goal is not at all the reform of a system or even to impeach Trump, or whatever. But I think that in general the left agrees on taking down this problematic power, and I think we should maybe work on figuring the rest out later. But these conversations are just important to have and really listen to other people. I've gone through a lot of different feelings on rioting, and especially as more of these things unfold, I feel like I change my views sometimes, and friends expose me to new ideas. So having these conversations is really important. I don't know, where do you think we should go from here?
So, I have like a few things written down. And the top one being what John Oliver said at the end of season 3. I think it's the most important thing. Is don't normalize it. Don't let it become normal. Like, he goes on to say, do whatever you need to remind yourself of that. And that, the way he said it and just what it's about, the context he put it in, it resonated with me very, very well. It's like, for me, obviously the first day, the Women's March, super powerful event. Like, I thought it was amazing. And I'm happy to see that march is all continuing. Like, living in Denver, there's almost a march going on every single week. I think the upcoming one's like March for Science, and there's
a climate one.
There's a climate one coming up, but they're continuing, which is great. And the other day I was just walking through downtown and ran into one. Anyways, like, they are continuing everywhere, and that's great. I'm happy to see that all the increases in donations of organizations that are being defunded and really do need help, most notably recently with the ACLU and Planned Parenthood. They've seen huge uptakes in donations. Keep doing that. I'm happy to see that people are still caring.
Yeah.
But I understand it's exhausting. I understand it's tiresome. But we need to keep doing that. We talked earlier today about even like me and you just starting this podcast. Over the last 2 weeks on this researching for these past 2 episodes, I've spent close to around 10 to 12 hours in total researching these 2 topics. And trying to put together show notes. It adds in a lot of podcasting work that's not specific to just reading about these topics, but being able to speak on them with comfortability, at least. But even though I'm interested, I still feel exhausted. My passion isn't dying down, but it is exhausting, and it's easy to be overwhelmed and just kind of let it slip for a moment. And for me, some of the major things I follow for a few days I couldn't even look at because I was so overwhelmed and so tired. But I caught myself and I'm like, this is how things become normal. It's that exhaustion that this administration's going after and making it become normal to us to expect Trump to pop up in the headline for some controversy. What is it this time kind of feeling?
Yeah.
And that feeling is not okay. Like, we need to keep up with this. And it's a big part of why we made this episode into 2 parts and not several episodes for every single part, because we, especially in this episode, we try to overview a lot more things and talk about things that are longer lasting, because the small issues, what he tweeted on Twitter, like his problems with Nordstrom's, whatever, like those are inconsequential. They're stupid. They are things made to exhaust us and made to make us feel that this is normal. And we can't fall into that. And I don't want to cover Trump every single podcast. And I really don't. I made this into 2 parts, like a 2-episode series, because I don't want to talk about him anytime soon unless some big news comes up. We're Casual Conversations, the podcast, not Casual Conversations about Donald Trump, the podcast. But this conversation does need to continue, as we, like both me and Dylan, iterated over and over again. These are very important conversations for us to have. And these conversations need to continue for the next 4 years, no matter how exhausting they are, like now, no matter how hard they are. They need to continue until he's out of the office or until things change for the better somehow. Like, we need to keep protesting, keep donating, keeping up with the news, and keep conversating about this presidency. As much as I don't plan on making another episode on this in the foreseeable future, because there are so much more that me and Dylan want to talk about, but I do plan on continuing to talk about this, whether it's just our everyday conversations between me and the people I know, or like if it's between me and Dylan, I'm sure when we see each other we'll end up talking about it, just probably not on podcast episodes. Or honestly I encourage this so much, but it's, if anyone's interested in talking to me more and like helping me learn more about this topic, like, let's continue this conversation online on our social media or through our email. Look up Casual Conversations, the podcast, on both. On Facebook, we have a Facebook page that I do want to start using and talking to people through. Or, you know, if you have like a longer form thing you want to talk about or you want to keep it private, that's completely understandable. Email us at casualconversationsthepodcast@gmail.com. Yeah, it's kind of a long email, but I don't want people to get things confused. And yeah, like, I know I'll be active on it and be more than happy to keep talking to people, regardless of if you agree with things I said or not, or just have slightly different views. Like, I really want to encourage people to contact us and have conversations about it. And whenever something important that comes up that would be big enough that we think we should talk about on the podcast, like, we'd be more than happy to bring it up again, if that's what we feel is needed. Or if small stuff pop up, we'll probably update it just before we get to our main topic or anything like that. But to close out the session, I want to bring up the Washington Post tagline again: "Democracy dies in darkness." Besides news and information and facts being the light we need in order to keep democracy running and to make sure we don't fall to any political ploys by anyone, I'm gonna quote some dumb, like, internet inspirational quote and ask for us to be the light that we want to see in the world and really keep conversating and make sure that we don't get overcome by this darkness and, like, don't be lazy about it and try to rely on news or the media or anything. Like, we need to be the ones to illuminate the darkness. That was a mouthful. I guess as a very big overview, Dylan, do you think the gathering of people and separating of people by different ideas and views and mentalities on a very small, specific mindset into almost like mini niche political group, like the miniature divides that we see on every side of the political spectrum right now. Do you think that's stronger in uniting or dividing us even further? And all these populist interaction overall give you a sense of positivity or negativity towards the future?
I feel like it's kind of a negative thing. I've talked about that with social media and how easy it is to kind of create a bubble and talk to only people who share the same beliefs as you. And you really, it's good on one hand in that you really develop these ideas, but you're also not really like seeing the real world, and you're not talking to people who are different and dealing with the people who see the problems differently, you know? So I think on one hand it's good to develop those ideas, but overall it's kind of troublesome to me to think that if we disagree with somebody even slightly, we don't want to talk to them. We don't want to have anything to do with them, because that's not how things are going to change. Like, I'm certainly set in my ways on certain things, and I am critical of all sides in many ways, but I still try to keep myself out of just getting into that bubble, because I don't think that anything's going to change if we do that.
Yeah, and I definitely resonate that pretty hard. I don't view it as a hard negative because there are a lot of pros and cons, and just generalizing it to one direction is very difficult for me.
Yeah.
But overall, I do feel it as negative because the powers in place are too powerful. Like, any super oppressive regimes have taken power by dividing the people first.
Yep.
And we're kind of doing that for them, regardless of if them is whatever political affiliations you believe in. And I don't, if there is ever a time to make it about us versus them, it is the disparity of power and rich versus poor.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're talking about power, even in the sense of just monetary power, like the rich are too rich and the poor are too poor.
Yeah.
Like, we really need to band together and put aside little differences, come to an understanding, and stand for a united cause for us to get things done. So, I guess the take-home question this time, your short answer question, besides all the different topics we touched on today, specifically I want to ask, like, do you guys get more hope or despair from the mentalities you see going around lately? How much do you actually trust the media or the government? And lastly, I would want to just end this whole topic with the famous Martin Niemöller quote of, "First they came for the socialists and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. So, where do you, the listener, think the line should be drawn of when we should speak out against problems? And if and when there is a time for violence, and where is the line drawn for that? And for next episode, we're probably gonna try to ease back a bit and introduce our next segment, which is called Overanalyze and Chill, where instead of doing intensive research, like for this two-parter, yeah, in total I probably did 10 to 12 hours, if not a little bit more, of just pure research on this. Instead of doing something so research intensive for us, we're gonna just watch one of our favorite shows and then relax and talk about it. And that show being Overanalyze and Chill is gonna be one of those podcast corners that's here to stay. As of right now, I'm thinking about doing it bi-weekly, but not 100% sure on the format yet. We're not completely set in it. But as of how it's gonna start is we're gonna just go through every single episode of Black Mirror and just overanalyze the hell out of it.
And if you haven't watched that show, get on it right now. Start watching, please, because it's such a good show.
Exactly.
And there's a lot to talk about in it.
Exactly. And that is easily my favorite show, and like I'm comfortable with saying that's my favorite show I've ever seen.
Yeah, I think it's the probably top 3 shows that I've ever seen.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about it next time. But yes, I do want to follow up what Dylan said, because we will not be avoiding spoilers. We will spoil the entire episode within the first 5 minutes of our podcast. Because there's we just can't hold back. So if you're one of the people who care about spoilers, make sure you watch episode 1 before next episode, if nothing else, because that's that we're purely going to be talking about that episode and the show in itself for our next episode. So, do you have any closing statements, Dylan?
No, I don't think so.
Alright, so tune in next time for our first episode of Overanalyze and Chill, the Black Mirror Saga, episode 1. For now, you could listen to us on SoundCloud and YouTube, and reach us on Facebook and through our email account at casualconversationsthepodcast@gmail.com.